And Gail, I'll kick it over to you to get us all kicked off.
Great. Welcome everyone to Prioritize and Focus, your local broadband community engagement. This is the second in our four-part series on broadband planning, data, and community engagement. I'm Gail Hike, Community Broadband Outreach Specialist with the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I will serve as your facilitator for today's session. I would like to recognize my Extension colleagues who will be working behind the scenes to ensure our session runs smoothly. Jessica Beckendorf, Community Development Outreach Specialist, and Chris Stark, Digital Equity and Inclusion Specialist. They will be monitoring our waiting room and will facilitate questions through the chat. Today's session is sponsored by Wisconsin Public Service Commission, University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension's Organizational and Leadership Development Program and Extension's Community Economic Development Program. We have a few housekeeping items before we begin. Today's meeting is being recorded, and the final video, along with the PowerPoint from the session, will be posted on the Extension Community Economic Development website. We will provide you with a link to access the video and worksheet as soon as they are available. As a friendly reminder, please mute your microphone when you are not speaking. During our session, we will offer 30 minutes of content, followed by an open question and answer period. During the Q&A, we will welcome questions on today's topic or any broadband planning question you may have. If you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will come back to them in the second half of our program. I am fortunate to have with me today my colleague, Sarah Schlosser. Sarah is the Division of Extension Organizational and Leadership Development Program Manager. She works with Extension colleagues across the state to conduct applied research and design locally relevant programs that grow the capacity of leaders and organizations to address complex community issues. With that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Gail. It's a pleasure to join you all today. Our objective for today's webinar is to identify the who, the why, what, and how to engage community members in your broadband and digital equity planning. We know that some of you have already started engaging community members and local partners, and others maybe aren't as far along. This session will provide you with some tips and resources to move forward from wherever you are currently. If you've attended prior workshops, you may recall the phrase Internet for All. Internet for All
Sarah, you accidentally muted yourself, so let me get you caught up there. There
gracious,
you go.
How did I do that? Okay, where did I leave off?
Let's take it from the top.
Take it from the top
on the Internet for All side. Be on the safe side there. So,
all right. Okay. So, my apologies. Okay. So, if you attended prior workshops, you may recall the phrase Internet for All. Internet for All in Wisconsin means that all Wisconsinites have access to affordable broadband service and equitably share in the benefits of broadband technology. I bring this up because Internet for All is the basis for how you should approach thinking about your community engagement efforts. So we keep using this term community engagement, and it's helpful sometimes to have a definition. So here are two definitions we can work with today. Community engagement can include the purposeful activity of community members taking part in decision-making outside of the electoral or the voting process. Another way we could define community engagement is the process of involving the public in problem solving, planning, policy setting, and decision-making. Both of these definitions are grounded in the belief that everyone who's affected by a given decision has the right to participate in making it. So today we're going to walk through 4 questions that are really important for your team to discuss. Who do you need to engage in your broadband and digital equity planning effort? Why is it important to engage these local partners and community members? What do you want to accomplish by engaging them? And then how can you effectively engage them? So let's start with the who. If you joined us for the May 18th workshop on building your planning team, you might remember that we talked about who to engage in broadband and digital equity efforts, planning efforts. So just as a quick refresher, or for anybody who maybe wasn't able to join us, we have two general groups of people you'll want to engage. The first is local partners. Local partners are the organizations in your community that have an interest in broadband and digital equity. For example, this might be local governments, schools, the business community, nonprofits, libraries, emergency services, and healthcare. The local partners may offer specific insight into the broadband and digital equity needs of your community. They may offer specific expertise that's useful in your planning, or they may have influence or resources that can contribute to proposed solutions in your community. The other group is community members. So these are the individuals or groups in the community who can provide perspectives, opinions, and experiences that will also inform your plan. You can think of community members as the likely users who will benefit personally and professionally from access to broadband and the tools and resources that support their digital equity. Also, during the May 18th workshop, we provided you with a worksheet called Engaging Local Partners and Community Members. We'll be putting a link to that in the chat. To be clear, the link that's being put in is to the May 18th workshop materials, and in there is a downloadable resource bundle, which includes this Engaging Local Partners and Community Members. I encourage you to download that worksheet as a great place to start in your team on figuring out how and who you want to engage, both the local partners and the community members. So after you've talked about the who to engage, it's important to think about why we want to engage them. Locally, you may have your own answers to this, and I'll give you a moment to think about that after we cover this slide. But typically, when we think about engaging community members in decision-making and planning efforts, there are two reasons for that. The first is community engagement produces better results. Why is that? Well, when we bring community members to the table, they bring with them their unique knowledge, skills, and expertise. Community members can actually articulate better for themselves the needs they have and possibly even offer solutions to meet those needs. And by involving community members in our planning processes and decisions, we actually make those plans and decisions feel more legitimate to the community. And in the end, we often likely receive less resistance from the community because they've been a part of the process. The second reason we engage community is actually because community engagement produces more engaged community members. When we invite community members to be part of planning and decision-making, they become more educated about issues in the community. They learn how decisions are made in the community. And engaging them invites them to be more civically engaged over time. So I'm going to pause for a moment, just give you a few seconds to jot down if there's any other reasons besides the two on the screen that your community, that your team might be wanting to engage members of the community in your broadband and digital equity planning. So we invite you, and there'll be a workshop that will be, or worksheet that we'll be providing you. We invite you to have this conversation with your entire planning team. What are the reasons why? Not just who are you engaging, but why are you engaging them in your planning efforts? So now let's talk about what. It's important to know what you want to accomplish. We don't want to just dive in and start involving people. We want to know what it is we're trying to accomplish with involving people in our planning efforts. So there are 5 purposes for engaging community members: awareness, education, input, interaction, and partnership. So I'm going to walk through each one of these. And when we do, we're going to talk about the purpose for each and also the promise that you make when you tell the community that this is what you're doing. So let's start with awareness. The purpose of awareness is fairly obvious, right? We want to make the community aware of your broadband and digital planning, equity planning effort. And what you're promising community members with awareness efforts is that you're going to keep them informed. They're going to be able to know what's happening and how it's affecting the community. If we move to the next level, and each one of these steps up the level of engagement with community members, the next level is education. So our purpose here is to provide the community with information that's actually going to help them better understand broadband and digital equity needs, concerns, solutions, and plans for the community. And with this, you're promising that we're going to try to help you understand these things. We're going to help you try to understand why this is important in our community and what we're trying to achieve. Moving up another level of engagement, we go to input. Our purpose here is to obtain feedback. You want to get that feedback on the broadband and digital equity needs, concerns, solutions, and plans. And so when you do this, you're promising to community members that you're going to provide opportunities for them to give that input. You're also promising that you're going to let them know how you used that input. If you think about a time when you've been asked your opinion and then later never knew how your opinion was used, it can be kind of frustrating. So part of your promise here really is to say, we're not just going to listen, but we're going to tell you what we did with that information. And then stepping up one more level of engagement is the interaction. So interaction, our purpose here is actually to work directly with the community to ensure that their issues and concerns are being consistently understood and considered in your planning efforts. Your promise here is that we're going to work with you to ensure those concerns are reflected in the alternatives, strategies, and plans of the community. And like with input, it's important that part of what you're promising here is you're going to share how their input influenced the decisions that are being made. The last and highest level of engagement is partnership. And this is where we place the decision-making responsibility in the hands of the community. And the promise is we're going to work to implement what you decide. So your broadband and digital equity planning effort is likely going to include several of these purposes for engaging community members. And to be successful with the goal of internet for all, it will be important to include community engagement that achieves input and interaction. And you may find that you'll do some awareness, you might do some input work, and then you come back and do some education. And so you'll find that this isn't a linear process. This is actually, you may go back and forth depending on what you're trying to accomplish and where you are in your planning process. So like before, I'm going to pause for a few seconds and invite you to take some time to jot down some thoughts about which of these purposes are important in your planning effort. So we've talked about who, and we've given you a workshop or a worksheet. We've given you a worksheet that you can begin to think about who you're going to engage. We've talked about 2 reasons why we engage community members in our decision-making and planning. And we've talked about what are the purposes for that? So now we're going to talk a little bit about how you can do that. So we're going to go back through each purpose, each of those 5 purposes, and I'm going to name some methods. And some of these are going to be really familiar to you. And what we're trying to do is just help you understand where they fit. If we want to do education, what's a good method for doing that? If we want to do input, what's a good method for doing that? In a few cases, I may give a brief description because it may not be as familiar of a tool. And also I'm going to note when one of these methods is going to be talked about in one of our upcoming webinars. So let's start with awareness. So on the screen, I've got for you again a reminder of the promise and the purpose and the promise you're making when you say, we're going to do public awareness. We're going to engage you at this level. So some of the methods that we can use to do community awareness include direct mailing, you know, the good old put it in the post office, put it in the post box kind of way of getting information out to people. News releases, mass media. For example, if your community has access to television or radio, you could use those as methods to get information out. Social media is another common way that we might get information out to raise awareness. And then you might even consider displays and exhibits. Maybe there's a place in the community that people frequent, and there's a good spot to put some information and keep a display out so people are aware of your broadband and digital equity planning efforts. So take a moment and just look at that list of methods. Which of these are some methods you've already used? Which of these are some methods that you might consider using as part of your efforts going forward? For the public education purpose, some methods that we find commonly used are public education meetings, websites, and newsletters. So if you're not familiar with them, a public education meeting can take a couple different forms. Sometimes that might be advertising a meeting and inviting the community to come in, and so you can educate them on the process and where you're at and what you're learning. But it could be presentations at existing venues. So maybe at school meetings or town meetings or civic group meetings. So going to the places where people are at and providing presentations that educate them on the process, the concerns and the issues and what you're learning. So again, just momentarily reflect, which of these public education methods have you already used? And which ones could you use in your broadband and digital equity planning? Moving on to public input. Some of the methods that are commonly used to gain public input include open houses, public hearings, surveys, and focus groups. During next week's webinar, we'll dive into two of these methods more deeply. We'll be looking at surveys and focus groups and how you might use those particular tools as part of your broadband and digital equity planning efforts. Are there any of these tools that you've already used? Which of these tools might make sense for your planning efforts? For public interaction, there's several methods here that you can use as well. And those include asset mapping, community forums, citizen advisory committees, and visioning. In 2 weeks, we'll be spending some more time looking at asset mapping and community forums. So if you're not familiar with those, make sure you sign up, tune in 2 weeks, and we'll dive deeply into those two tools. If you're interested in visioning as a way to get interaction from the public, we encourage you to refer back to that May 18th Building Your Planning Team workshop website that we dropped earlier in today's session. During that particular workshop, we actually shared an example of how you might engage your planning team as well as community members in visioning for your broadband and digital equity planning efforts. So if visioning is something you want to do, take a look back at those resources. So again, I'll just ask you to reflect. Which of these public interaction methods have you used? And which might be valuable in your broadband and digital equity planning? And lastly, public partnership. So we said this is the highest level of community engagement. And the primary method here is a citizen planning committee. So just to give a little definition of what that means, these are formal groups. Typically, they're comprised of local government officials and community members. And on these planning committees, Each committee member has full voting privileges, and the committee is actually charged, given the responsibility of designing, implementing, and evaluating the planning effort. Some of you actually may be members of a citizen planning committee. It might be called something else, but you may go, I'm already on one of those. We're already doing that. And thus, congratulations, if you are, you're actually already engaging community members through this particular purpose and method. It isn't necessary if your planning team isn't structured this way. It's not a requirement by any means. It's one way that community can be engaged. As we've discussed, there are several other ways that community members can be engaged. So how do you pull this all together? You've identified who using that worksheet and having conversations as a planning team. You've talked about why you need to be engaging and why it's important to engage community members in your efforts. You've looked at those 5 purposes and said, okay, which of these purposes are we trying to accomplish by engaging community members? And then you selected some methods, the how. How are we going to go about doing that? So what your plan looks like, all these pieces allow you to create a simple community engagement plan. And what your plan looks like is going to be unique to your community. You have unique resources, you have unique demographics, and so every community may have a slightly different way in which they want to and should engage their community. But there are several guidelines that you should consider as you think more about how you'll engage community members. So first, multiple ways to engage. Community members should be given several ways and opportunities to engage. This allows them to engage in ways that they find valuable and at times and in places that work for them. For example, the opportunities to engage might include a public survey that community members can fill out at the local library or online. Then later in the planning process, you might have a community forum where community members can attend, and it's held at the local school, and they can engage with the planning team and provide more input and discussion with the planning team. Now, they could engage in both of those opportunities, or maybe the survey is the thing that they have the time for, but you've given them multiple ways to engage. The second guideline is equitable access. With the focus on the internet for all, it's important to remove as many barriers to participation as possible. So what could that look like? Here are a few examples. It could be that making sure the location for your open house is wheelchair accessible. Having an interpreter available during a focus group discussion. And making surveys available in multiple languages and at public locations, such as schools and libraries. The third guideline, the third guideline is to communicate how input was used. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but if you want community members to engage and to continue engaging, it is important to let them know how you've used their input. So for example, after you compile the results of a public survey, you could create a press release that explains what your planning team learned from the survey and how that information is being used to write the broadband and digital equity plan. And fourth, and often forgotten as a guideline, is celebrate milestones. Part of engaging the community includes celebrating milestones. It's a really easy one to overlook, but it's important. Celebrating milestones helps people see what's working, it strengthens relationships and engagement, and it creates positive momentum. An example of what that could look like, you might host a community celebration, invite contributors, community members, the press. During this event, you can recognize the people who've been part of the planning process, and you can share progress on the plan. We will be providing you with a worksheet. That worksheet is going to step you through all the things I covered today. So thinking about who, why, what, and how. In the how section, we'll have each of the methods and they'll be mapped against the various ways in which, or reasons by which you want to engage community members. We'll also have in there a sample, and it's just one example of how a community might go about engaging community members. to achieve multiple community engagement processes. So when the resources for this webinar get posted, I encourage you to check out that worksheet, print it off, and have a conversation as a planning team so that you can get your community engagement plan in place. With that, Gail, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Before we move on to the questions and answers, I want to thank all of you for participating in our webinar today. As Sarah said, we will be posting the recording and the PowerPoint from today's session shortly. I want to remind you, if you haven't already done so, to register for our third session in this webinar series, which will be held next Monday, August 21st. Again, we'll be meeting at noon till 1. At that time, we'll be joined by Barry Hotman and Sharon Lesberg, who are both community extension development educators, and they will help us explore when to use surveys and community conversations as part of your data collection. We will provide you with a survey and conversation templates that give you some tips and best practices. I welcome all of you to stay online for the next 25 minutes, where we will open up the floor to questions you may have, either for Sarah or for any general questions you might have about broadband planning. We'll start the question and answers from the chat. And Chris, I think you're going to lead us through questions and answers.
Yes, so very, very well done. So thank you to Sarah. So the first, it's a commentary in the chat here by Todd Cruz, Todd Cruz, but about education methods, reaching the public, if you will, utility bill inserts, school newsletters, houses of worship newsletters, etc. Todd, you're welcome to unmute if you choose to and add to that. But if not, that's okay too. We thank you for your commentary here. And I wanted to read, I know Cliff had a comment here with respect to county broadband champions, meeting to break down barriers and promote broadband adoptions in vertical markets, meaning in healthcare, real estate, education, ag, the veterans, remote workers, etc. Same thing, Cliff. You've been at this for many years. Do you choose to, do you want to add to that right now, or?
Yes, I'd make one comment. One of the things in Polk County when they held theirs, they had about 35 people in attendance, and it was amazing what each one of us learned from each other, especially in agriculture and veterans. We were not aware of how much broadband was sensors and different applications being used in the ag business in Polk County. So that actually got everybody else excited, and we had a great conversation, and we really appreciated the support from everybody. Gail was there, and Danielle was there, and Kara, and Jaron. It was really, really well. So I would encourage everybody to gather your champions and provide internet for all.
Okay, thank you very much. And we've all learned a lot from that, those interactions in the counties. And obviously Gail has worked in many, and I've worked in a few as well. And so, all right. Let me go down to Mary Ann's question. Mary Ann, good to see you on. And your comment here, equitable access includes time of day. Folks who work a regular 8 to 5 schedule cannot participate in daytime meetings. Do you want to, same thing, Mary Ann, do you want to open up and elaborate just a little bit?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious. I think a lot of folks that work on this as part of their job prefer meetings during their working hours. And to really engage a community, particularly individuals, you've really got to look at multiple times, including the evening.
Yes.
Convenient for us, for folks that work a regular 9, or you know what I mean. But yeah, equitable access definitely includes time of day.
Indeed. So thank you. I think everybody here agrees on that. From Tess, would it be possible to email the webinar recording, PDF slides, etc.? I think we're and worksheets. Are we? How are we with sharing all of those?
Yeah, we'll be able to link, we'll be able to share a link to the page where all of that will be housed. But the files will be too large to share them, to send them over email. For most people, they'll be too large.
Okay, all right, thanks. Okay, do we have any other comments or questions? Or if so, we have time here. If not, that's perfectly okay. However, if you do, I would ask that you, if you don't want to put it in the chat, that's fine, but I would ask that you unmute. This is your time to pose questions to us, and we'll see if we're able to answer them to the best of our ability. But a little bit of time for discussion. I see one new message just came in.
This is Pat. Can I don't know how to raise my hand on here.
That's all right, Pat.
Can I ask a question? On the community committee, because they get so large, you know, as I envision it anyway, or they can be with all the people that you want involved in this, can you just have a core group for voting on things? Otherwise, I could see how do you manage can it be quite unwieldy, I would think. So if you have a planning committee, it would seem to me it would be sensible to have a core committee of those people from the, you know, the anchor institutions and those that with public input, but not necessarily voting members on critical things. I don't know. Can you talk about that a bit?
And indeed, how do we, if we have a core, more of the planning committee, but if you have well, go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, and I'd invite those of you who are more specifically working with broadband, but I think generally when you're working on a large community planning or decision-making type effort, you want to include as many people as possible, and it can get overwhelming the more people you include. And so I do think that it makes sense to think about different ways in which people can weigh in. And so one example that comes to mind is they may not be the ones that make the final vote, but you can also do advisory votes, right? You could hold an open house, or if you have regular groups that are regularly meeting already about broadband work, let's say you've got 3 alternatives for your plan. You might be able to, you could go to the community and say, hey, here's 3 alternatives we're considering. We'd like to hear from you about which alternative you think makes the most sense and why. And so you could have them vote and give input that way, although they're not making the final decision. They're sort of advising you, if you will, on what that decision might be. So that's one solution I can come up with immediately for how you might get more input, but also still recognize that ultimately it's a smaller number of people who make a final decision on a plan. I don't know, Gail, Chris, Jessica, others, if there's any other ideas you want to add in response.
No, I think you covered it well, Sarah. I think a lot of times we want to be as inclusive as possible to get input from others, but recognizing many of you who are doing the gathering of data and putting forth the recommendation are an advisory group. You among yourselves may have to vote to put together some type of proposal that you want to put forth to the governing body, who in the end is the one who's going to make the decision. So I think there's different ways to do it. Some communities during their community organizational meetings where they have just to gather input, we'll do some straw votes to see what people are interested in, and then the governing body moves that forward.
And Chris, before you jump over to Tessa's raised hand, I just want to, I think Todd's comment in the chat is actually relevant to this current conversation, right? And so I love that suggestion, Todd, that you could create subcommittees, right? And so maybe people aren't giving input on all of the, everything. There are certain things that their expertise or their passions or knowledge can contribute to. And so those subcommittees can dive deeply into pieces, but that smaller, sort of larger group then takes all of that and pulls it all together.
And I also recognize Todd's point that all of those, broadband is critical to all of those that he mentioned. And we can go on, and we can obviously only add to that list. And we will try to, in the coming weeks and at our workshops, indeed address all of those, Todd. It's hard to. I will also point out the workforce development issue is so important, I guess, is kind of near and dear to me personally, and the critical importance of that in getting everyone educated with digital skills, that is, for the future and the workforce that we're evolving into. It's not future, it's actually here now.
And I think that's part of when Sarah was talking about going to existing meetings and groups, these would be great groups for people to gather that information from. So you may not invite them to everything, but you're going to their specific venue to gather that input. And I think those groups that you listed, Todd, are right on. Those are ones that a community would really want to make sure they engaged with as they gather input.
And then Marianne has posted a question here that when will the PSC program guidance be posted? I don't know that one off the top of my head. Is there, not sure if anybody from the PSC is on right now that might know that. And Alyssa, you're being Matt Marcus today. Okay, so thank you for joining.
Matt's here too. I think I stole it off his calendar. The initial proposal will be sent to NTIA in December, and then they need to review and approve it. And then from their approval, we'll sort of put guidance out. And so part of the timeline is dependent on the federal approval of our proposal. So sorry to give you a mushy bureaucratic answer. So December, you'll have a good idea of what the state's hoping to do. And sometime in 2024, you'll have a better idea of what the federal government has approved will do.
Marianne, could I have a follow-up question?
Yes, please. This is the time for
Thank you for that big picture look. What about the Capital Projects Fund program guidance?
It's up right now.
If
While you were in this webinar, it went up 12/21 today. So you can go to our website, go to the docket. The website might still take a little bit of cash, but you can look in IRF. I can put the link to it in chat in 1 second for you. Okay. But
wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I checked right before I logged on to the webinar, but 12/21 was the time. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks for jumping on, Alyssa. Much appreciated. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, from the state broadband director herself, right there. So
I just put the link to IRF in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. And then I think I missed Tess here. Neglected Tess. Sorry, Tess, if you want.
It's okay. Thank you. I don't have a very good question, and it was partly answered by Alyssa. I think when I see the PSC program guidance, I'll understand better where we fit in sort of the chronology, trying to get perspective on these ideals of drawing in community members and establishing these programs and groups versus sort of the loose stage that I feel we're in right now. And the nuts and bolts still aren't clear to me. I'm working on a county committee, and we have received approximately $20,000 in BEAD planning grant money so far. And that's just enough for us to send out one mailer to our residents. So these are a lot of objectives that we're talking about. And are they going to come in the form of further BEAD planning funding, or are these initiatives that the local governments are expected to take on their own initiative and budget, or how is that anticipated to happen?
A lot of very good questions involved in that. I'm gonna call on both Gail and Alyssa for the answer on that, on the BEAD, since as it's related to the BEAD planning funding and a lot in there.
Well, I would say a lot of the initiatives that you're taking on right now are going to be at a county level and at your county expense to a degree. I think the Public Service Commission has provided that $18,000+ for communities to start working through the process. And it's going to be up to counties and communities how much they delve into that local process. We encourage communities to continue their work on the local process, and the way communities will be, or projects will be funded through BEAD, will certainly learn more from the Public Service Commission as their proposal to NTIA is approved and that comes forth. Alyssa, do you have anything else you want to say towards that? Oops, can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I think your answer was perfect. I don't have anything else to add. Thank you.
Gail, I do want to add, well, not on sort of the resources part, but when you all look at that worksheet, I think, Tess, you raise an important point, kind of more broadly, which is there's the ideal, right? The way that who you want and the ways in which you want to engage the community. And so it's always important to start there, like, what is it we hope to do? But you do have to balance that. Like, what do we know about our community and how they like to engage? What are the time and resources, including money, that we have available? So when you think about it, it does, you sort of start with that ideal, and then you have to temper that as you figure out what you're going to do with those other factors, your community and the time and resources you have. So I want to lift up, Tess, that you raise a very important point, that we talked about kind of the perfect, the big, the ideal, and that's not what we all are operating under in most cases.
And I guess I would encourage communities, we're looking at ideal, and you're going to pick and choose the things that make sense to you. But remember all of the work that you're doing now, and we'll be talking, especially as we move into the regional workshops and developing those public-private partnerships and how you work with internet service providers. Those are going to be the things that are going to help you to access BEAD dollars as they come through, and they're put out by the Public Service Commission to move projects forward. So any relationships you can build right now, partnerships within your community, with those different organizations that are in your community, with the ISPs that we'll be talking more about, how you do that in the next 2 months. Those are all going to be critical, because those who are best equipped to access those dollars are going to see probably success first, because they already have those relationships, that plan, have thought through that process.
Tess, you had some very good questions, and I see you've gotten some comments there in the as from Marianne, and obviously a similar comment from Todd. But are there any further questions? Does anybody have any? Again, this is time for this is your time, if you will, for questions. And if not, going once, I think Gail will turn it over to you for concluding remarks. But yeah, you have to unmute.
Yep.
everybody's
Yep.
not
Thanks,
unmuted.
everyone. We will see you next week as we delve into the surveys and community conversations.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.